So I want to ask, what is spirit? How can we think about it in a way that sort of makes sense? Um, right. So firstly, I think one way to sort of describe it is that spirit would be unobservable, right? You can't see it with the naked eye. Um, However, we need something more to differentiate it because, like physicalists countenance unobservables all the time. They posit these, mind independent entities. So we need a further criteria that will differentiate, let's say spirit from matter. And I think what that is agency. Right? The spirit is not just unobservable, but it is an agent, right? With its own, set of abilities and goals. So I would want to affirm that spirit is real, right? And its theoretical role in an ontological scheme, right? We're just thinking about this in a technical sense, right? The spirit would be the principle of motion, right? This is, we can go back to Plato, who thought that, the psyche or the soul or the spirit is self-moving, right? Meaning that its source of motion is internal and not external, right? And so we can sort of see self-motion as describing something that is organic and lifelike, right? Whereas if the motion is external, then it's inert and it is machine-like, right? But so that's more to say on this later. So in the scientific revolution, right, we inherited a Cartesian grammar of motion, which soared as quantitative, linear, and purely external, right? You see motion as sort of displacement within space or displacement across space in a particular duration, right? And so, this again, this idea of motion, let's say would be contrary to a more Platonic scheme. And I just want to add that, Plato, I think, can be reconciled with physics, and Wolfgang Smith is actually a very able advocate in that, or I should say was, RIP. I mean, seeing motion as just like spatial displacement, uh, exterior in an exteriority regime. There's a sort of Cartesian grammar that we inherited, right? This sort of way of seeing. And, for Bergson, seeing motion like this would be incurring a mistake, right? And the mistake is spatializing time. Alex Gomez-Marine, he said that one of Bergson's key insights, his opinion or his idea, that time is not space, right? And if you look at Wolfgang Smith in his ontological scheme, he says the same thing, right? Time and space are separate, and in fact, for him, time takes primacy, right? And so, they aren't just differentiating space and time; they're also sort of giving time as priority. And so, they're obviously they disagree with Einstein. I mean, Bergson and Einstein had a whole, there was that great debate that they had in the 1920s, about this specific issue. Right. And so, Chris Langen's Riaz. Well, before I even get onto that, if if you know Chris Langen, right, and you're aware of his work, chances are you think that he's like a sort of a crackpot who spouted off a bunch of meaningless techno babble, right? And his ideas are not to be taken seriously. Maybe you saw the Professor Dave video, or maybe even just before that. And I get it, I understand, but I would implore you to sort of look at the content of the argument and not the person who's proffering it, right? Let's just see how it stands on itself. All right, and so Chris Langen's reality principle basically states that there is nothing external to reality, right? If something is real enough to affect reality, it is therefore inside reality, and so there is no outside reality. And this is basically the same thing that Lee Smolin says, right? So Lee Smolin says, like, the first rule of cosmology is that there is nothing outside reality, right? They're saying the same thing there. And what does that mean? That means that necessarily reality's source of motion is internal, right? And again, if we link internal source of motion to, organisms or things that are lifelike, then we get again to the sort of Platonic sense where Plato did see the universe as a sort of a giant organism rather than an inert machine. And so that is interesting to think about, so that the spirit of reality would be its internal source of motion that propels it forward. Okay, let's continue on this train, motion and spirit, right? So let's sort of again go over the chain of associations that I'm trying to get here. Right? Spirit is the principle of motion, right? And any entity which has its source of motion internal to itself is lifelike, and motion is related to time, right? So we got time, motion, life, and spirit. Then we're trying to, I know that's a bit of a loose amalgam, but let's just stick with it. And we're going to read an excerpt from Chris Langen's paper, and I'll link it in the description. And yeah, once again, content, not the person who's producing the idea. Okay, so here he's talking about space and time, and he's trying to show why space and time are sort of distinct, right? And how that works. Okay, so let's read. All right. Let's look at the problem more closely. The processing of one state into the next occurs between states, right? E.g., to produce state 2 of X from a prior state 1 of X, processing must occur between S1 and S2 in a processing or state transitional interval. But the processing interval, S1, S2, can have no duration and therefore must remain hidden, as otherwise there is a time lag during which X has no state at all and thus drops out of the display medium, right? And so this is basically saying that we only see states, right? And we see states changing, but we don't see the thing that's causing the state to change, right? The state transition interval, right? And because if we did see the state transitional interval, that would mean there'd be a moment where X has no state, right? Because in the state transition, you got, X has state 1, and then you got the state transition, and that carries it to S2. But if the state transition, had any duration and you could see it, that means that there would be no display, right? As X couldn't sort of be displaying S1 and S2 at the same time. So let's carry on. Thus, what gets displayed in real time are instantaneous state transition events coinciding with the states themselves in the display. Real time becomes discontinuous if the transition of one state into its successive state coincides with the display of a single state. Thus, processing and display are necessary distinct functions and must alternate. The display must therefore be stratified, with focus between a hidden processing layer and a visible display layer. In other words, avoiding perceptual or observational disruption requires that processing be hidden so as not to occasion discontinuities between displayed states. But this contradicts the supposition that the display has both processing and display functionality. To put it as succinctly as possible, processing is not displayed, right? This is important. This is basically just sort of reaffirming what Bergson said, and just, I think, giving maybe a more technical argument, although I haven't, read a lot of Bergson, so, don't hold me to that. But what he's trying to convey here is that time and space, right? Time is processing and space is display. They cannot coincide, right? And therefore you must have a hidden processing layer and a visible display layer. And this is, the same thing as Bergson saying, do not spatialize time. And so if we follow that thread, right? That means that the processing domain, which is a time domain, right, which you can see as a domain of motion, is a domain of spirit, right? It's a domain that is hidden and isn't displayed. But you'll give a more concrete example in the next slide. So one way to think about this is that every observable line is circumscribed by an unobservable circle, right? So you can even think about this in your lifeline. Your birth to your death isn't just a line, right? That line was drawn by a circle that you can't see, and that's that circle is your in the scheme I'm trying to provide here. It's spirit, and so we can see all motion as emotion, right? And this again, we need to bring back the bifurcation of nature, right? It might feel unnatural to sort of attach motion, which we typically see as like res extensa, right? Motion is out there, like a source is out there, and emotion is inside here. But again, if we buy Whitehead's bifurcation of nature, where he says that this is a mistake, right? Decisioning apart interior entities from exterior ones. And so in order to heal that bifurcation, we need to stitch these things back together, right? Which is stitching motion and emotion. So, it might feel or sound unnatural, but if we think about it like a stitch, like if we're gonna use a stitch to close up a wound, it's not gonna exactly be comfortable. And I guess in this analogy, we don't have any anesthetic. So yeah. Okay, that was all a bit abstract. So let's try and concretize it and bring it to bear on something that is sort of more easily graspable. Right, so let's say that we have a sentence, right? And so first word is the, and that's state one, right? The second word is cat, and that's state two. The arrow is the stage transition between state one and state two, right? So just as you're saying, the arrow is state transitional or processing or time, right? And the words are the display elements. Those are the things within space, right? And yeah, there you go. So that's a state transition function, right? Between the word the and the word cat. And so once again, that's processing. Third word is jumped, right? And we can say that is state three. And again, between state two and state three, we have a state transition, right? A processing. State two to state three. Okay, so note how we can only observe the sentence, the cat's jumped, but we cannot see the state transitions between, right? So when you're like reading a book or a story, all you're seeing is words. You aren't seeing the state transition that transforms state one to state two to state three. That's basically what Langen was trying to show, right? That this processing necessarily is hidden. It is not displayed. And so if you think about the words of the sentence as bodies and the things that are processing the states as spirits, right, in the processing domain or in a state transitional domain, notice that these things are hidden, right, which goes back to our spirits being unobservable, although they also need to be agentic or be agents, and so that's, haven't sort of brought that in, but just keep that in mind. Right, so think about each object in your panorama right now, right, as a state. Right, you have different objects in your room, like I can see like a lamp, a laptop, a TV, a pot, and a book. Each of those things are states. We can either state one, state two, whatever. When those states change, right, we see something move from here to here, we see it change color or whatever, that state transition is a spirit, right? But again, processing is not displayed. The spirit is not body, right? Time is not space. So keep that in. Processing is not displayed. Time is not space, right? This was Bergson's key idea, and I think the way that Langen sort of phrased it is very helpful in understanding this. Okay, and now we're going to be looking at the spirit less technically and a bit more mythopoetically. Right? We'll look at it in a mythological sense and a more poetic sense, using mythology in the way, Peterson / Yon / Viveki would use it in terms of, it not just being decorative description, but sort of capturing cross-generational persistent patterns. Okay. So in the mythopoetic sense, we can see spirits as the breath or the wind, right? It's the wind and our breathing are both very motion-centric things, and they're also invisible, right? You can't see the breath, you can't see the wind, and so it maps on, in a sort of archetypal sense, onto the breath and the wind quite well, I think. To look at these things, mythopoetically is also sort of affirming the dream analogy from earlier, where so you look at things symbolically, not literally, right? And that's sort of what we're still trying to emphasize right now. Right, we can see in the Bible that the Holy Spirit was described like a dove, right, which again brings to mind, right, the sky, the wind, motion, and in fact, birds are also very common sort of imagistic tools used when thinking about spirit, right? And so if we think about this sort of, again, in a more poetic way, and we're thinking about the creation of the universe, there is this common through line through a number of different cultures, right? Of how reality began. And it starts with a primordial ocean, right? It's just like ancient, timeless ocean that suffuses everything. It's kind of all encompassing. The Egyptians had Nu, right? That was their sort of a name for this watery chaos. This primordial watery chaos. The Sumerians had Apsu, and the Hebrews, had Tehom, which is interesting because that's what's used in Genesis, right? And it's interesting that the ocean is the image used here because, again, it's like the ocean is boundless, right? If you think about it from the perspective of our ancestors, right? They're looking at the ocean and this thing is boundless. It just goes on forever, right? And this boundless or unboundedness brings you back to the no-thingness, right, of Viveki and Nishitani, right? A thing is bounded and no thing is unbounded. And so you can see that the no thing here is analogous to the ocean, which is boundless and all encompassing. Can also think about it like Plato's Kora, which again is the receptacle of being. So, with this framework, we can sort of look at the Genesis creation myth again, anew. Right? And so verse 2 says, "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the waters." So a couple of interesting things here, right? Without form and void. Again, that's talking about something that is boundless or unbounded, right? The no thing, right? And darkness was upon the deep. They translated Tehom to deep, and Tehom is sort of meaning the same primordial in Hebrew anyway, meaning the sort of primordial watery chaos, right? So darkness was upon the face of Tehom, of this primordial ocean, and the Spirit of God moved upon the waters, right? Notice how the Spirit again is being tied in with motion, right? And it is being tied in with activity. And so it's the Spirit of the God moving upon these primordial waters that sort of was the impetus for these things. And I think that's very interesting to think about it like that. And so we can sort of play with this Trinity a bit more. This was Rupert Sheldrake who kind of put me onto this onto these parallels between the Christian Holy Trinity and the Hindu Trimurti, right? So in the Christian Holy Trinity, we have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? And so we can see the Father as the primordial ocean, right? We can see the Son as the Logos, or the what bestows pattern and order, upon the movements. And then the Holy Spirit, right, we can see as the wind rippling the surface of these primordial oceans, right? Father is the primordial ocean, Son is the pattern order, and the Holy Spirit is the principle of activity. It's what gives the whole thing activity. Now, the Trimurti, what we have is, Brahman, Vishnu, and Krishna, right? And so Brahman would be the father, if we're comparing it to Christianity, which would be, again, the primordial ocean. Vishnu would be the sun, right? Which again we'll compare to patterned order. So Vishnu is sun, is patterned order, and Krishna is again, creation and destruction. This is what activates, gives the pattern. So Krishna would be the Holy Spirit. And it's interesting that these two faiths sort of happened upon these triadic structures, right? And sort of happened upon very similar ways of construing it all. There's this artist Sampha, and he's great. He released this album Lahai a couple years ago, and really great. It took me a while to sort of settle into it, but beautiful album. And he spoke a lot in the album, like if you think about thematic through lines, about spirit, about sky, about clouds, and about birds. And I don't think that that's coincidence. I think the fact that those images sort of coalesced and organized that way for him in the album is showing that creativity is an epistemic organ, right? He's using his creativity to disclose something about the nature of spirit. And if we that sort of relates also back to John Vervaeke's 4Ps, right? Because remember, I had a overly narrow conception of knowledge, which was just propositional. John Vervaeke sort of opened me to the other modes of knowing, right? The procedural, the perspectival, and the participatory. And now we can see this as sort of a further expanding of what knowledge could be, right? And so someone who's making an album, who's making music, is also sort of producing knowledge. And if we look at the cover of the album, right, it's the sky and clouds, and that's very sort of serendipitous for the sort of picture that I am trying to paint here, right? And this is also why my logo is the sky and the clouds, right? Because I was always a kid whose head in the clouds, and so it's Spirt, right? And that's sort of what I'm trying to convey with ideation. Another way, right, in which things sort of changed, which is linked to the sort of quality foundationalism, is to understand things like intuition, imagination, emotions, and whatnot as genuine epistemic organs which disclose salient aspects of the world, right? And this is contrary to the sort of the scientific revolution, which sort of saw these epistemic tools like intuition, imagination as rather soft, right? And so it's experimentation and reason that is most lofted high above. And experimentation and reason are extremely important, and it's a major, I think, discovery, because that's sort of what gave science its power, right? And how it's become so central to the modern way of living. But I would just want to, on top of that, sort of affirm how things like, reason and experimentation are actually still kind of based on creativity, intuition, imagination, right? It's just a bit more of a more rigorous sense. And so I'd want to affirm that. And yeah, this is again like quality foundationalism, right? You take seriously phenomenology as a raw material, whereas before it was just seen as like an optical closure, something you have to bypass or climb over in order to get to the truth, right? Which is sort of mind independent and completely independent of all experiences. And so you have to control for these things and push them to the side, whereas my new perspective sort of takes them as the raw material for metaphysical speculation. And Brenton Rohn, who I think we read a quote sort of earlier, he put this succinctly well in his paper on panpsychist idealism, and so we'll read from there. Right, so this is Brenton Rohn. The motivation of this article is hence to provide phenomenological arguments for idealism. The approach uses phenomenology as a guide to metaphysics in combination with taking seriously the findings of the sciences. Such an approach, which can be referred to as an analytic phenomenology, is beginning to be defended and taken up by some philosophers. In my view, this science-inspired approach, which takes seriously our phenomenological data, is one of the surest methods for avoiding the possibility that when we do metaphysics, we are merely playing games with words. And I just want to sort of pause and linger on that for a bit. It's very interesting because, people who are sort of more naturalistically oriented and view metaphysics with suspicion, right? They tend to see experience right, more as like an obstacle to the truth that you have to control for and get past. But here, Brenton Ram is saying taking it seriously is actually what will prevent us from, the charge of metaphysics being merely conceptual word games, right? It's what keeps us on firm footing. Okay, let's continue. So, why use phenomenology as a guide to metaphysics? Since first-person experience is a basic form of evidence, we don't need to justify the assumption that experience can show the nature of the world. Beginning with the way things are given is simply more scientific than ignoring the evidence or dismissing it. The assumption is not that this evidence is infallible, but that it provides prima facie defeasible justification for metaphysical claims. The burden of proof, I claim, is on the objector who wants to disregard the first-person evidence. So yeah, that's quite interesting. And I liked what he said about phenomenology not being infallible, right? Because we can be wrong about things that we're introspecting upon, and we can make all sorts of mistakes. And so we wouldn't want to treat our first-person experience as if it's just as if it's without error. And so we need to do an analytic phenomenology, right? And what would that look like? Well, the way I'm sort of thinking about it now is, what I said earlier, all metaphysics are just elaborations of intuitions. And so, there's Amanda Gefter who said something that I found quite interesting. And she said, I think this was an interview with Kurt. She's a great, very cogent thinker, that what is real is what is most invariant, right? And so if we're looking at analytic phenomenology, we're trying to find out what are the most invariant aspects of our experience that we can use then to existentially generalize to the rest of the world. Right? And so if we take, for example, let's try and look which segment of our experiences. We try and look at our external domain, right? The world, again, of tables, chairs, and mountains. Is that invariant? Well, you close your eyes and it's gone, right? So we can sort of strike that off the table. And if we sort of elaborate and go on this, we'll actually find out that what is invariant across all of our experiences, right? What is the most invariant aspect of our experience that we have? It would be this raw generic awareness, right? Kastrop always uses this example. If you were in a sensory deprivation chamber, right, and you had complete amnesia, so you weren't even really recording memories, you would still have this raw subjectivity, this I. And because that is what is most invariant, that is what we should existentially generalize, right? And that's how you sort of get things like a cosmic subject. And so I think that's sort of an example of how analytic phenomenology would work. And so we're gonna look at another quote here. This is I saw this on a paper by Matt Siegel. And the paper is Physics Within the Bounds of Feeling Alone, which, interesting title, very salient to what we're discussing here. And I saw this quote because, Siegel's he's a Whiteheadian, broadly speaking, although he is not chained to it, so to say. But okay, let's read this Whitehead quote. The primitive form of physical experience is emotional, blind emotion, received as felt elsewhere in another occasion and conformably appropriated as a subjective passion, in its relevance to a world beyond, though the relevance is vague. In the phraseology of physics, the primitive experience is vector feeling, that is to say, feeling from a beyond which is determinate and pointing to a beyond which is to be determined. And, this is really interesting, the fact that he sort of blended a word that's sort of native to physics and maths, vector, right, and one that's emotion, vector feeling. This is, again, an example of trying to heal the bifurcation, right? This move only makes sense if you agree with that the bifurcation of nature was a mistake and we need to find ways to heal it. And so this is just another example of how we can sort of take phenomenology seriously and, sort of start seeing forces as vector feelings. Right. And another way that we could go about this, which is again, quite speculative, but just note again that it is motivated by trying to heal the bifurcation of nature. Okay, so, and it's about bosons, right? So we can think about, bosons are force carriers, which have integer spin, right? You have things like photons and gluons, and they do not obey the Pauli exclusion principle, like fermions do. Fermions are typically considered as like the constituents of ordinary matter as we sort of typically think about it, right? And so the Pauli exclusion principle, we can sort of think about that as an impenetrability thesis, right? Because materialism in the 17th century had these properties that matter has, and one of them was impenetrability. You can see the Pauli exclusion principle as sort of an elaboration, on that, which is to say that, different fermions cannot inhabit the same quantum state. But bosons, right, bosons can share the same quantum state. And so, it's, if we're going to try and sort of use that in an analytic phenomenology sense, we can see how, consider earlier when I was talking about dual aspect monism, and we needed to motivate why you would choose dual aspect monism. And so, one of the motivations is like, why do our interior worlds, thoughts and emotions, present so differently than to the external world? External world is more public, the internal one doesn't seem to be as much. And so we need to explain this, right? It's something that requires an explanation. And so I sort of cited Bohm's implicate order, and this is sort of like a non-spatial order where things are enfolded upon one another. Bohm uses that word, enfolded upon. And so I think we can see enfolded upon as being bosons occupying the same quantum state, right? And this is sort of the speculative leap, right? If you think about emotions, right, you can feel excited and anxious at the same time, right? You can think of the anxiety and the excitement as inhabiting the same state, right? And so if we think about emotions in a sort of bosonic sense where they can occupy the same states, then, it's interesting. And, again, this might sort of feel unnatural, right? Might seem like a philosopher untrained in quantum mechanics, right? A clumsy interloper. As if you watch Succession, that's what Carl said to Tom, called him a clumsy interloper, which is funny. But sort of clumsily going into this thing and making sort of wild speculations. But yeah, I'll once again reiterate that this is from the perspective of trying to heal the bifurcation of nature, right? And sort of stitch together the interior and the exterior instead of, the Cartesian grammar where they are seen as separate. And, I'll link a video. Julian Mossbridge had something to say about this, very interesting. And another channel, Teleodynamics. He also mentioned, I couldn't find the specific video, but, these are the two thinkers who have sort of pointed to bosons as a very interesting doorway into thinking about some of these other things. And I'll link the channel, Teleodynamics, and the Julia Mossbridge interview, where she speaks about bosons and consciousness, specifically. Right, so, these vector feelings, this is how we heal the bifurcation of nature. And, I think I use the metaphor, stitching together without anesthetic, right? You stitch a wound without anesthetic, it's going to feel painful and sore. Okay, and let us continue. This will mean sort of finalizing, how my beliefs have changed from when I was an atheist materialist to where I am now. So, I am now more prone to think that there is some form of afterlife or beyond. Because if you're a non-physicalist in any stripe, then, the mind is not bound within the circumference of the skull, right? And, if you're physicalist, the mind is sort of bounded within the circumference of the skull, and therefore, the notion of an afterlife doesn't really even make sense, right? And, it doesn't see how it could be possible. And actually, it's funny because I remember I was talking with a friend about this a couple of years ago, and they were Muslim, and we were talking about death. And so they asked me what I think, happens when you die. And I said, I think it's just sort of infinite nothingness. And then I asked them, what they thought. And they said that in their faith, basically, your soul gets weighed on a scale, right? And if I think that it's measured against a feather or something like that. And if your soul is heavier than the feather, then, you sort of lived a life that's heavy with sin, so to speak. But if it's lighter, then you did well. And yeah, it's funny now because I think I'm actually more prone to seeing that as somewhat true. So yeah, I'll link some videos below regarding this. One from the Nature of Reality channel, which is, just sort of going over a couple of studies of near-death experiences and showing how they might indicate something of an afterlife. And then I'll link a Formskin video about death, and the afterlife. My video is a lot more sort of speculative, but it is broadly aligned with sort of how I'm seeing things. And so, I think if we want to understand what death is like, right, what the afterlife will be like, then sleep and dream states are our best clues as to what death is, right? It was Nas who said, sleep is the cousin of death, right? And that's, that's an old myth. Like sleep is the brother of death. Like sleep and death have always sort of been related. And so I think that gives us our best clues to what death is. And so I'll read an excerpt from this paper by Gregory Shushan on near-death experiences. And here he's sort of citing a Welsh philosopher, old Welsh philosopher called H.H. Price, who had the theory of afterlife, which is relevant to what I think. Okay, so let's go. So let's read. The model best suited to address the problem remains that of the Welsh philosopher H.H. Price. He posited a world of mental images, a mind-dependent reality that to the disembodied spirit would seem as real as life on earth, including the impression of having a physical presence and use of the bodily senses. Indeed, it might be so similar that individuals would have considerable difficulty in realizing they were dead, a theme reflected in some NDE accounts. Disembodied spirits would appear to each other as telepathic apparitions and communicate telepathically. Furthermore, like-minded individuals who share, for example, similar memories, ideas, values, or culture would collectively create their surroundings, with each soul contributing to the group afterlife, while also bringing personal, idiosyncratic features into being. The result would effectively be numerous different dream worlds. The way they manifest would be determined by the co-creator's memories and desires, meaning that a person's cultural background and individual psychology would manifest within the experience. The barriers between the conscious and unconscious mind might dissolve, leading to experiences created by states of the mind, both positive, love, harmony, fulfillment, and negative, guilt, fear, and anger. Right, and these correspond to the NDE theme of the evaluation of one's earthly life, which is sort of a life report. It's the reports of distressing NDEs, and I think that links back to the weighing the soul on the scale, right? Which is a sort of belief in Islam. At least I was told about what happens, during the afterlife, and so yeah.